We go. So welcome everybody. I know we've just kind of had a chat, so this sort of more formal welcome seems a bit redundant, but anyway, welcome to the third in our series Reading the 1920 edition. Tonight you have a double act between myself and Paul Norgate, who's very kindly joining us again after his wonderful birthday lecture a couple of weeks ago. And we've decided that we would share the sort of burden of talking about the poems. And I'm going to be offering some thoughts on greater love, and Paul will talk about the Apologia. And before we open for discussion and Q&A, so I hope you'll find, I'm sure you'll find his thoughts interesting. You may not find mine as much, just a few sort of housekeeping notes. Please, can you put yourselves on mute while we're doing the talk, because it just saves background noise. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts, please put them in the chat, and between Bonnie and I will be managing those. If you would like to ask a question or make some comments in the Q&A or the discussion period, please put that in the chat as well, and then we'll just ask you to unmute yourself and share. And also, of course, the recording of this will be available on YouTube shortly afterwards. And of course, we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as to Twitter. And obviously, if you've not already done so, please subscribe and become a member of the WOA, and all those details will be in the chat during the talk. So finally, before I begin, I think it's important to recognize that the 1st of April is the anniversary of the death of another important, great poet of the war, Isaac Rosenberg, who, as many of you probably know, was killed on the 1st of April, 1918, after a night patrol near Arras. And there may be some points of comparison or discussion that we might want to bring in the Q&A. As well, with those of you that are very familiar with Rosenberg's work. So just thinking about him today as we discuss Owen. So I'm going to start off, and then I will hand over to Paul. But each of us are going to read the poem first, and then offer our thoughts as we go through our slides. So first of all, Greater Love. Red lips are not so red as the stained stones kissed by the English dead. Kindness of wooed and wooer seems shame to their love pure. O love, your eyes lose lure when I behold eyes blinded in my stead. Your slender attitude trembles not exquisite, like limbs knife-skewed, rolling and rolling there, where God seems not to care, till the fierce love they bear cramps them in death's extreme decrepitude. Your voice sings not so soft, though even as wind murmuring through raftered loft. Your dear voice is not dear, gentle and evening clear, as theirs whom none now hear, now earth has stopped their piteous mouths that coughed. Heart, you were never hot, nor large, nor full, like hearts made great with shot. And though your hand be pale, paler are all which trail your cross through flame and hail. Weep, you may weep, for you may touch them not. So Greater Love was drafted either at Craiglockhart in October to November 1917, or at Scarborough between November 1917 and January 1918, and then revised in that summer in July. The manuscripts held at the British Library include 2 fair copies, the ones that I had at the very beginning, and 3 heavily corrected pages. These are 2 of them. There's also a single sheet held in the Weston Library in Owen's collection there, which is contains 1 stanza. So these are the sort of extant manuscripts of the poem. And as you can see on this sheet, Owen's crossing out of the dedication here. First of all, to physical beauty, then to any beautiful woman. And then in this copy here, to any woman. And he completely excises that from what later becomes the fair copies and of course the printed edition. And I'm going to return to this point later. So as with all of Owen's manuscripts, these pages show the poet's mind at work. And we could take a lot of time just going through each of these changes. And they show the distillation of his ideas and his efforts to find the right word, the right phrase. And I always think it's really interesting to look at a poet's manuscripts, why these are so important, because it shows you that poems don't just become fully formed out of the pen. They're just sort of romantically, ooh, there they are. Poets work at their craft, and Owen was no different. And of course, this also poses issues for his editors that come after him. And this is a continual issue with a lot of Owen's poems, because not all were in their final form. Greater Love was first published in the 1920 edition and clearly bears the traces of his war experience on the Western Front, echoing a number of his other poems at the same time. So in line 6, if I go back to I haven't put the actual line numbers on here, but hopefully you can look at them also if you're looking at your own texts. Line 6, we have Eyes Blinded, which of course recalls the blinding of his servant in January of 1918, which he describes in a letter to his mother Susan, and then of course is reimagined again in the poem The Sentry. Line 12 is reminiscent of the fragment Cramped in That Funneled Hole. And the phrase, the piteous mouths that coughed, in line 18, reappear in more gruesome detail in Dulce Decorum Est. Owen's use of the term piteous features in Strange Meeting, with the piteous recognition in fixed eyes. And of course, this version of the word forever associated with Owen, pity. Okay, so these are sort of themes that come up again and again in Owen's poems, resonances of words, of phrases, and images. But of course, it is the Bible that is the first and most obvious reference, and is one that both tops and tails the poem. The title refers, of course, as we know, to John 15, line 13. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. While the final line, weep, you may weep, for you may touch them not, echoes Jesus's words to Mary Magdalene in John 20. Mary stood without the sepulchre weeping. Jesus saith unto her, touch me not. So Owen returned to the precept, of course, of greater love in another poem at a Calvary near the Ancre, when he declared, but they who have greater love lay down their life, they do not hate. And so it's really indicative of the many ways in which he struggled with the dogma in which he had been so steeped and with which he had been seen being used in the service of war propaganda. The Bible was Owen's earliest and probably most important literary influence, as John Stallworthy has noted, and as Douglas Kerr has so cogently demonstrated, church discourse was one of his key speech communities. For although he rejected organized religion well before the war, there was, as Kerr argues, no unremembering the scriptures, which had been his daily reading for the best part of 2 decades. Declarations from both the established church and evangelicals in support of the war effort rankled him. As he wrote to his mother Susan from the casualty clearing station, the 41st Stationary Hospital at Galley in May 1917, I am more and more Christian as I walk the unchristian ways of Christendom. Already I have comprehended a light which would never filter into the dogma of any national church, namely that one of Christ's essential commands was passivity at any price. Suffer dishonor and disgrace, but never resort to arms. Be bullied, be outraged, be killed, but do not kill. It may be a chimerical and ignominious principle, but there it is. It can only be ignored. I think public professionals are ignoring it very skillfully and successfully indeed. Have you seen what ridiculous figures Frederick and Arthur Wood are cutting? These are two evangelical brothers, traveling evangelists that Owen had seen before the war, and then he sort of sees that they're in the press again. If they made the great objection, I should admire them. They have not the courage. And they were basically discussing the importance of sacrifice in the war. To begin with, I think it was puny of Fritz to deny his name. He changes it from Fritz to Frederick. They are now getting up a petition mentioning their unique powers, invaluable work, and so on, and wish to carry their work from 82 Mortimer Street West as usual. I do not recollect Christ's office address in Jerusalem, but in any case, I don't think he spent much time there. St. Paul's business premises, if I remember, were somewhat cramped, not to say confined. But I must not malign these brethren because I do not know their exact apologia, as a nod to Paul there. And I am not myself a conscientious objector with a very seared conscience? The evangelicals have fled from a few candles, discreet incense, serene altars, mysterious music, harmonious ritual, to powerful electric lighting, overheated atmosphere, palm tree platforms, grand pianos, loud and animated music, extempore ritual. But I cannot see that they are any nearer to the kingdom. Christ is literally in no man's land. There men often hear his voice. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for a friend. And I think that setting off of for a friend is very key. Is it spoken in English only and French? I do not believe so. Thus, how you can see how pure Christianity will not fit in with pure patriotism. So I've quoted this bit of the letter at length because I think it really encapsulates a good deal of this struggle that Owen was going through after he had seen battle, after he had been wounded, was shell-shocked, and this struggle that carried on from his years in Dunstan about the nature of organized religion, of the pontifications of organized religion. And so in the poem, it is the greater love of soldierly sacrifice, that is for each other, that transcends any platitude, such as for God, king, and country, and obviously even any notion of romantic love. The soldier is Christ-like in the poem, and of course not for the first time. As Dominic Hibbard and John Onions in their 2007 anthology, The Winter of the World, noted, from the spring of 1915 onwards, war poetry's most frequent image was of the soldier as Christ figure, motivated by greater love, carrying his own and the world's sins and atoning for them by his death. The sensuousness that Owen learned from Swinburne, and indeed John Stallworthy regards greater love as response to Swinburne's poem Before the Mirror, verses written under a picture, combines with the biblical proclamation to provide a contrast between romantic love and the Christ-like sacrificial love that is shown by the soldiers for each other. Dominic Hibbard, of course, argues that Owen goes further to suggest that the love of soldiers, the love that soldiers show in sacrificing themselves, is greater than that shown by a lover and as great as that shown by Christ himself. Romantic love, moreover, observes Hilda Spear, is measured against the perfection of this greater love and found wanting. The comparison, she says, gains cumulative power throughout the poem. The inadequacy of romantic love is emphasized again and again by the repeated use of the word not. The soldier sacrifice extends beyond the romantic, even as Owen foregrounds the sensualness of physical love, I would argue. So red lips, slender attitude. He echoes passion in the words kisses, trembles, rolling, hot, exquisite, and perhaps even masochism in the echo of Sebastian's martyrdom in line 8, where he says, trembles not exquisite, like limbs knife skewed. And even just the running through those words and reciting this poem, as indeed a lot of Owen's poems, tripping over the sibilants, tripling over the lines. That's part of the complicated reading experience that I think that he wants us to have. I think Owen is also echoing here his cousin Leslie's poems in his rendition of Kisses and Lips, but to the opposite effect of what Leslie does in his poems. And this comes in for a great deal of sort of criticism between Owen and Sassoon in his letters, which I can say more about in the Q&A, but I think Paul may be alluding to some of that in his observations. But scholars such as Dominic Hibbert have noted the homoerotic and sexual tensions in the poem, while James Najarian has argued that in Greater Love in particular, Owen, quote, formulates the expanded role for same-sex sexuality, end quote. Najarian also notes that feminist critics have treated this poem with some disdain, saying that Gilbert and Gubar claim that the poem targets the entire female sex, while Adrian Caesar believes the poem is no more than a misogynistic tract. Now, it's this latter analysis that I really want to challenge briefly and take issue with, as indeed Najarian does, although from a very different perspective. If I return to the heavily edited version of the manuscript, Owen's cancellation of To Any Woman, such a cancellation, I think, is reminiscent of another, that of the dedication to a certain poetess, to Jessie Pope, etc. Why did Owen cancel each? My feeling is that he saw these as unnecessary. The poems speak for themselves. And while the deletion of Jessie Pope allows the addressee, the my friend, to be either male or female, the deletion of To Any Woman here not only removes an unnecessary repetition, it's clear from the poem that Owen is speaking to a woman, but it lessens the accusatory sense of the lines. I don't hear the disdain as I do in Sassoon's Glory of Women, for instance, or as we do in Dulce Decorum Est. Rather, I think in the terms of endearment, oh love, your dear voice, heart, I hear gentleness. I don't think they're meant to be sarcastic or said with disdain, however much they are immediately tempered with the violent scenes of war and of wounding, of blinded eyes, knife-skewed limbs, piteous mouths that cough, hearts great with shot. Okay, so these are deliberate juxtapositions, but I don't think they're meant to be there to denigrate the beloved, as it were, or to any woman. So I guess this draws us back in a way to what Paul was discussing in his birthday lecture about the women in Edinburgh that Owen knew, and of course his sister and his mother. Owen seems to me to be reinforcing the gulf that will always remain between those who experience battle and those who do not, but not in an accusatory way. Between them always stands the ghosts of all those English dead. So the final line, I think, is very different to what we get in the final line of the Apologia. Here, Owen doesn't use the word but. He doesn't say, weep, weep, but you may touch them not. he uses for, as if because it is the only thing that you can do is to weep for them. And I can see why Owen Sitwell decided to put these two poems in juxtaposition against each other, Greater Love followed by Apologia and the contents, because I think these things are now working very much in parallel. So with those very brief reflections, I will hand over to Paul to get his thoughts on the poems. I'll stop my sharing and allow you to share them, Paul.
Thank you, Jane. Hang on, sorry about that. Did that last time, didn't I? It would help if we start. Okay, sorry about that. Let's get going. Thank you, Jane. Just briefly by way of introduction, I'm not sure that either Greater Love or Apologia would be the first port of call for contemporary readers, but I did find, incidentally, whilst I was browsing around, an interesting little sidelight in this little magazine, The Woman's Leader from 1921, a review by Vita Sackville-West, who actually says, of them all, that's of Owen's poems, of them all, perhaps the most admirable is Apologia pro Poemate Meo, but it is hard to choose among excellencies. So there you go. Apologia. I too saw God through mud, the mud that cracked on cheeks when wretches smiled. War brought more glory to their eyes than blood, and gave their laughs more glee than shakes a child. Merry it was to laugh there, where death becomes absurd and life absurder. For power was on us as we slashed bones bare, not to feel sickness or remorse of murder. I too have dropped off fear, behind the barrage, dead as my platoon, and sailed my spirit, surging light and clear past the entanglement where hopes lay strewn, and witnessed exultation. Faces that used to curse me, scowl for scowl, shine and lift up with passion of oblation, seraphic for an hour, though they were foul. I have made fellowships, untold of happy lovers in old song, for love is not the binding of fair lips with the soft silk of eyes that look and long by joy whose ribbon slips, but wound with war's hard wire, whose stakes are strong, bound with the bandage of the arm that drips, knit in the welding of the rifle thong. And I have perceived much beauty in the hoarse oaths that kept our courage straight, heard music in the silentness of duty, found peace where shell storms spouted a reddest spate. Nevertheless, except you share with them in hell the sorrowful dark of hell, whose world is but the trembling of the flare, and heaven but as the highway for a shell, you shall not hear their mirth. You shall not come to think them well content by any jest of mine. These men are worth your tears. You are not worth their merriment. Well, I'll start like Jane with the manuscripts. Apologia is an interesting one because there is quite a good selection of manuscripts. I mean, we never quite know how many are missing, but there's a good selection here that takes us through the development of the poem. The very first one, this one here, is actually only 2 stanzas. Perhaps a bit difficult to read on the screen, but it's actually what we now know as stanza 1 and stanza 3. Owen didn't get around to his eventual stanza 2 for quite some time. And then the next one, he's actually up to 4 stanzas, 1, 3, 4, and 5. And then, as I say, stanza 2 appears. This is an interesting one. You can see how Owen's underlining those introductory lines. He's obviously got a sense of structure in his head somewhere that he wants to highlight. Now we've added a stanza 5, and this one also has a second page. So in effect, we are now up to the complete poem. So from 2 stanzas to 4 up to 9. That's quite a jump actually, which, as I say, may suggest that there are 1 or 2 sheets that we don't have anymore. But by now, Owen has a complete poem. And all the drafts that remain from here on in are in the same format, 9 stanzas, 2 pages. And amongst those is this one, which most of you, I'm sure, will recognize. This is the one which is in the British Library folio, and it's virtually a fair copy. There's barely a correction on it. It has a date at the end, November 1917. And this, of course, is the text that all Owen's editors have worked from. Stallworthy, in the complete edition, calls it the final fair copy. I'm not entirely sure about that. I'll come back to that in a moment. That date, of course, November 17, tells us that Owen probably did most of the drafting then whilst he was at Scarborough. Although I do actually think he probably worked on it over a rather longer timescale than that. The origins of it, I think, reach back into the last weeks at Craiglockhart in October. And it's almost certain, I think, that he was working on it still in 1918. Certainly, Stallworthy's detail tells us that the paper he used on the last 2 drafts is one which was being used mainly in early 1918 rather than 1917. Well, the poem itself, the whole thrust of it, I think, really is to justify and to defend, or perhaps rather aggressively to defend, an area of experience which will be by definition beyond the ken of most of his readers. This is going back to what Jane was saying, the experience of the soldier in battle. It is, in a sense, quite sort of passive-aggressive, you might say. And it's interesting, I think, that instead of seeking to draw us in to the soldier's experience, to help us or even force us perhaps to share and understand, Owen almost seems to me here to be insisting on that unbridgeability, the gap between the soldier and the civilian. It's one of the things, I think, which makes this perhaps rather an awkward poem. Now, part of that awkwardness is in the tone of it, I think, that rather strident assertion all the time. Right from the opening line, I too saw God. It's a sort of combative, competitive note. And that second word, the adverbial to, very interesting, very deliberately awkward almost. And part of the effect of it, I think, is to wrong foot the reader. It sets the poem off, as it were, at an angle, past the reader. What, you're not talking to me? Who are you talking to? This is somebody else. So who is this unidentified other with whom Owen is finding it so necessary to engage? Well, if we move on to stanza 5, again, somebody that Jane has mentioned, here, happy lovers in old songs, love the binding of fair lips, etc. Owen seems rather set here on administering a slap to his rather unfortunate cousin, Leslie Gunston. Leslie's collection of rather weedy romantic poems, perhaps, was published about the same time as Owen was working on Apologia. And that love is the binding of lips, that is a direct lift from one of Gunston's poems. Actually, though, I think that's a bit of a distraction, really. And I think that this stanza is perhaps the weakest part of Apologia. If I can presume, I think he could have toughened it up considerably if he'd just telescoped stanzas 5 and 6 together. One interesting detail, if you notice, is that the rhyme is exactly the same in both stanzas. Fellowship song, lips long, slips strong, drips thong. So I'm sure he could have ditched the lovers and their lips and gone from fellowships to war's hard wire, which of course is a reference back to Graves's Two Fusiliers. So I don't think Leslie Gunston was Owen's main target. As I've said, the origins quite probably go back into October 1917. And leading up to that time frame from the end of October into November, across 4 weekly editions in September and October 17, the Sunday Pictorial published a series of 4 articles by a journalist describing his visit to the front. The Pictorial was, of course, a national newspaper, and this series of articles had been very widely advertised as a journalistic event. It was by just about the most famous journalist in the country at the time, Horatio Bottomley, demagogue, would-be politician, journalist, and editor of John Bull magazine. Now, with the public starved of first-hand as opposed to official news from the front, Bottomley's articles made a huge impact. My tour at close quarters. And of course, this is exactly what they were intended to do, not least because Bottomley intended all these articles as a way of increasing pressure on the government to give him a position in the cabinet. He'd been badgering the authorities for ages to let him visit the front line. And now that he'd finally got permission, he was very anxious to make sure that to his readers, clear to his readers, that his version of the war would be different from the other ones they'd read. Quite near the beginning of this first article, it's actually the bottom left on the screen at the moment, but don't worry, I'll put it up on the next one. At the beginning of that first article, he says, boasts, if you like, that unlike most of those civilians who go to the front, I didn't remain at the back. I'd made it known that I'd come out to see things, not merely to hear about them. Later on in the series, Bottomley sums it all up as my special visit to the front. I say special visit because really I did go to the front, and thanks to the courtesy of the High Command, was afforded facilities such as few civilians have enjoyed for seeing the war in all its grim reality. So here we've got essentially a civilian claiming to have experienced exactly what people like Owen and Sassoon and the rest of them might have been through, almost. Well, in fact, it turns out that the great Horatio actually got not much nearer to the front than a morning spent in the support trenches. And that was described in his very first article. The remainder of his visit, as the headline tells you here, was to places well behind the current front line. Nevertheless, he managed to spin all this out into three more articles, 4 in all, making ever more preposterous claims about his understanding of the war and his insight into its meaning and purpose. If we're to be fair at all, there are just occasional moments where it looks as if he might actually have seen things directly, as he puts it, learnt something. I could not but marvel at the satire upon our civilization, which directed all this energy and enterprise and capital to the destruction of life and property, instead of into channels for the happiness and welfare of mankind. But there's not much of that, I'm afraid. Much more often he veers off into a sort of pseudo-religious cant. But then came, apparently on the breeze of the battlefield, the old message: God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform, and subjugating my puny intelligence to the great heart of the universe, I thought I saw the meaning of it all. God grant me light to understand it. Well, of course, in reality, Bottomley had hardly any more knowledge or understanding than the average journalist. But that didn't matter to Bottomley, or presumably to many of his readers. Instead of information, what Bottomley constantly professes is a conviction that the war was evidence of God's plan, which he called the Great Audit, and that everything that happened, disasters included, was part of a divine mystery into which he, Bottomley, had been vouchsafed unique insight. Well, Owen's letters in the summer of 1917 show that he certainly was familiar with botanist journalism. And whilst he was at Craig Lockhart in September and October, I'm sure he must have seen the Sunday Pictorial series. Coming at a time when Owen's horizons were suddenly and rapidly expanding, and with Bottomley claiming, as he did, special insight into the conditions at the front, it's hard to imagine that all this didn't provoke some fairly animated reaction from Wilfrid and Siegfried. The fourth and the final article of this series appeared on the 14th of October. Here it is. And by this point, if you get round to reading it, Bottomley is scarcely bothering to tie all this sentimental moralizing to any specifics about what he'd seen in France. By this time, he's built up such a head of steam that he can just make a few general gestures at the content of what he wrote in the earlier articles, and off he goes into some sort of rhetorical orbit. I returned from these scenes of horror and desolation, of hideous destruction and crashing ruin, of pain and anguish, with a burning impression of having also seen the glory of God. Verily, God was not silent. Now that my ears were attuned to his message, the still air as I stood on the Somme battlefield was vibrant with silent voices. I suddenly realized that what I had mistaken for silence was the perfect harmony of heaven. I'm sure you're already hearing echoes of all this in Apologia. And so on and so on it goes. And it builds up to the peroration, as you might say, the very end of these four articles. This one, I think, is a clincher. I can say no more. To the relentless skeptics, I can offer no concrete proofs. I can only relate a wonderful experience that has been mine, a vision of apocalyptic glory. I have been in hell, and from the depths have seen the shining splendor of heaven. In the scorched and blackened track of the devil, I have met with God. Well, I too saw God through mud. You met him, says Owen. I too. And I met him through the lives and deaths of soldiers in conflict, not through some journalistic cant. So I think a key feature of Apologia is that the immediate and specific trigger, I mean, there are other things in there, but the immediate and specific trigger for it was this series of Sunday Pictorial articles. And his primary target, the person he's speaking to when he says, I too, is Horatio Bottomley. I'll just add one more detail about this. As a kind of, all these articles, as I say, that they were published in the national press, Sunday Pictorial. Bottomley, as I've said, he had his own magazine, John Bull, and as a kind of taster for the Sunday Pictorial series, Bottomley published a kind of summary version in John Bull. He entitled it Somewhere in Hell. There's the cover. And it came out just a few days before the first of the Sunday Pictorial series. And interestingly, in it, the way Bottomley sets this out, his summary of his visit to the front, it's almost like a series of biblical verses. These are not the complete things. These are just the first lines. I have seen 50,000 men in a hospital. I have seen 1,000 silent graves. I have seen a weeping mother. I have seen the lads in the trenches. I have looked over the parapet. I have sat alone with Sir Douglas Haig. I have held the hand of the dying. Well, if you think at the same time of the perhaps slightly unusual stanza structure of Apologia, you can't help, I think, but see how the form itself of Owen's poem mirrors and at the same time challenges Bottomley. I too saw God, says Owen. I have dropped off fear. I have witnessed exaltation. I have made fellowships. I have perceived much beauty. I just took one of Bottomley's verses at the top here, and I've set it out in the format that Owen uses, and without any alteration. You can see how it's almost exactly. I have seen a weeping mother, he says, sitting at the graveside of her son, calling down the curse of heaven upon his murderers. And there underneath is a typical Owen stanza. One other feature of that John Bull article is that Bottomley actually uses subheadings. He goes through a sequence of what I have seen, what I have done, what I have learnt. And if you look and think about it, I think Owen's poem actually follows something like the same structure, except that those final couple of stanzas comprise not so much what I have learned as what you need to learn, Mr. Bottomley. Well, I'm working from, obviously, the printed version of the poem, the one that everybody uses, dated November 1917. But with all due respect to John Stallworthy, my own sort of work on the manuscripts actually suggests that that one, there it is actually quite likely not his final fair copy. Now, it may well be the final fair copy of the poem as Owen conceived it in the autumn of 1917, in the heat of that sort of reaction, that response to Bottomley. But there is another draft of the poem, which, now, again, I apologize, this is small and you won't be able to work it all out, but if you can take my word for it, if you can decipher the sort of the base version of this, what he starts with before he goes into all those revisions, the base version of this is almost exactly the text of the previous one. So it's as if he's made two copies here and then gone on working on the one of them. And the changes he makes are very interesting, particularly in those last stanzas down the bottom right-hand side there. I'm afraid there isn't time to explore it this evening, but I suspect from what he's writing here, Owen is beginning to move away from that direct attack. These men are worth your tears. You are not worth their merriment. And this is a transcription of what his final stanza looks like in this other version. First line's the same, but the rest of it is different. You shall not hear their mirth, whom brilliant dangers like near lightnings warm. Only to gods and men grown sick of earth, hilarious sound those thunders on that storm. Well, it still needs some work, but he seems to me to be moving off in a different direction in 1918. And it wouldn't be the only case amongst Owen's manuscripts where this happens. The version of the poem that's been printed and accepted for the last century or so isn't actually Owen's very final intentions. Well, I'm still working on that, and I'll stop there for this evening. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul. I open the floor to comments, questions.
Can I just trail something, Jane?
Yes.
Paul has written an article for the journal, which will be in the next 2 volumes, using some, though not all, of those brilliant insights. And I think it gets better the more you hear it.
Wonderful, great. Yes, because I think Elizabeth Vandiver has asked me about details of if Paul has published this somewhere. So it is coming or should be out soon. So brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Bottomley is, I don't quite know what word to use. He's fascinating. He's unbelievable. But he's also very instructive in lots of ways. So I've been pursuing him for a bit. It's not just Apologia. So pay yourself and Owen, get your journal.
Owen refers to him a lot in his letters.
Several times, yeah.
He does, yes, yeah. including one instance, which I was looking up while you were talking, where he says, I fear I've written like a converted Horatio Bottomley.
Yes.
So there's much to be said around that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I open it to the floor for questions or comments. Elizabeth, yes, Vandiver, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Paul, thank you so much. That's absolutely brilliant. And you have completely persuaded me, convinced me that the poem is indeed an answer to Bottomley. I think that's extremely clear from what you've laid out. My question is, this poem has often been read as a response to Robert Graves's letter to Owen, in which he says something like, Jane can probably have the exact words, but something like, for God's sake, cheer up and write more cheerfully. A poet should have a spirit above wars. I think it's something like that.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you could comment on that. Do you think he is in any way responding to Graves, or do you think this is entirely Bottomley? I know there's a chronological problem with the
yes,
date
I mean,
1917
that's the main one, and everybody who mentions it, Dominic and John, all the rest of them, they all say it's tempting, isn't it, to make that link. But there is that date, which Owen seems quite definite about, November 1917, and that letter, I think, was sometime in December.
I believe so.
There is an overlap. I mean, I mentioned there's clearly a reference to Graves's Two Fusiliers with the image of the wire.
Yes.
The other thing I think that turned me away from that sort of response to Graves was, well, if it is, okay, but then in a sense he's still talking to somebody at the end when he gets so dismissive. You are not worth. I mean, that's not Graves, surely.
That can't be Graves. Precisely. No. That's what has always troubled me about that. The I too saw God through mud does, I think, sort of work as a response to Graves. You're telling me to cheer up and write more. I forget the adverb he uses, or buck up and write more cheerfully, I think it is, something like that. And so the beginning, I too saw God through mud, works with that, but you're absolutely right that the end cannot be Graves. He can't be talking about Graves there. No. So I think you've nailed it. I think that it's got to be Bottomley. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, there's also, on the one manuscript, the bit that he misquotes from Barbusse. If there be a cheerful, is it a bright side or a cheerful side of war, yet it is a crime to mention it.
Yes.
So, I mean, there is, in terms of allusion and quotation, there's quite a lot going on. But
absolutely.
I think if we want a real trigger, I'm glad you find it convincing. I was just so bowled over when I got to the very end and read that, you know, I have seen God in the mud, as Bottomley says. I thought that's got to be Apologia.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I mentioned this other manuscript draft, which I think is probably later than the version we have. I too saw God becomes I too saw gold, which is different,
yes.
but of a piece with the idea that I think Owen has decided that sort of ad hominem attack is possibly not the way he wants his poem to be permanently fixed. And the further he goes through the poem, the more he seems to be moving into sort of generalized apologia for the experience of the soldier and the unique and almost inexpressible. I mean, it comes up in Spring Offensive. It comes up in several places, doesn't it? And it's in his letter, you know, the one about keeping the line straight and the exaltation of showing ourselves. He's writing to Colin, I think. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. An extraordinary exaltation in walking slowly and showing ourselves.
And also written as sort of lines of poetry, because they're individual lines that he.
Yeah.
One more comment, Paul, if I may. I think your reading really strengthens what I've always seen as one of the most haunting lines Owen ever wrote, in my opinion. Heaven but as the highway for a shell. The idea that what has happened to the soldiers has decreased their experience of nature to the point that the world is but the trembling of a flare and heaven but as a highway for a shell, with Bottomley saying that, I have been in hell, but I looked up and I saw the glory of the heavens. I think those two lines about heaven juxtaposed with one another really, really strengthen your reading of the poem. So again, thank you.
Thank you. I don't know, I can turn this round into questions and see what other people think. I'm interested in the final stanza when Owen says, "You shall not come to think them well content by any jest of mine." And I don't quite know what other people make of that word jest. Is he referring to this poem when he talks of a jest? What do we make of that?
Can I speak up again, Jane? I don't want.
Yeah,
to
please do. I was just about to go anyone, but please.
Okay. Particularly given that the title uses the classical term apologia, defense, I've always seen that as a kind of what classical rhetoricians would call a praeteritio or perhaps a recusatio, mentioning something by saying you're not going to mention it, or refusing to do something. The classic praeteritio would be the kind of thing, I am not going to speak about the fact that my opponent in this campaign has murdered several wives and buried them in his backyard. No, that is not the point at issue. That's a praeteritio. A recusatio is, I can't write what you want me to write. I can't do it. I'm not capable of it. And I think what he's saying there is, I am not going to write a cheerful poem. I'm not going to write something that says, as he does in Smile, 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 they're happy now, poor things. I'm not going to give you that. I'm refusing to write the kind of poem that you want soldiers in the trench to write, I think.
You're much more of a classicist than I am, Elizabeth. I couldn't stick names to it. I will mention something else, which I think I mentioned to Jane the other day when I was chatting to her, but on the slightly more flippant side, something else I came across, because it did occur to me, where did he get that title from? There's nothing on the manuscripts that suggests he showed it to Sassoon. I mean, there are no corrections as there are on 2 or 3 other manuscripts. We know that Sassoon eventually, presumably at the proof stage of the 1920 edition, corrected the poema to poemate. But I think it's in the Scotsman, somewhere towards the end of October, the sort of thing that Owen and Sassoon would probably read and backwards and forwards across a table at the club. There's a review of a book by the grandfather of the Mitford girls, Lord Redesdale. And it's called his Further Memories or something like that. It mentions that his eldest son was killed and that in his later years Redesdale withdrew to his famous gardens, and his first love was his garden. Indeed, he was to write an Apologia pro horto suo. But this must remain one of the unwritten books of the world. And I thought if Wilfrid and Siegfried read that, they would probably laugh about it for the rest of the day. And it just occurred to me that whether he was putting that on the top of it to see what reaction he'd get from Siegfried. But then it stuck. I don't know. But that's more on...
Of course, to Newman, right?
Yes.
Newman.
Yeah, I mean, there is the serious one. And that came up in one of the passages that Jane showed us, didn't it, when he was talking about the brothers, Frederick and what's it? I do not know what is their apologia, he says. What are they about?
Thank you. Viv Welpton, did you want to make your comment, maybe?
Yes. What I wrote there for Jane was, I take it that you and Paul reject James Campbell's notion of combat Gnosticism, because this is a charge that could very strongly be made about Apologia, of course, isn't it?
Do
do people know what the combat Gnosticism refers to? People are going, no. Viv, do you want to? I can, but it'd be nice to hear you do it.
Okay. Well, basically, the notion that that combatants like Owen felt that they belonged to an elite, that no one could actually know what war was about except a combatant, and that they formed, you know, kind of the top of the hierarchy, if you like. It's a fairly disparaging view, I think, of a poem like this, but it's a poem like this that is the source of that kind of notion, isn't it? That be...
Yeah, I mean, I kind of always read Campbell's more or less about more of a criticism of people like Fussell and others rather than the poets themselves. But maybe I need to go back and read it. Maybe I read it incorrectly, but I saw it more as really a critique of people who anthologized the poems and who wrote about the poems, as opposed to the sense of Owen himself
in the prioritizing of combatants.
Exactly.
The combatant poetry. Right.
Yeah, that's what I thought. But and I don't think it's hard to separate. I mean, there is a gulf, but I don't necessarily think that gulf is one that was disparaged, in the sense that I think, particularly from Owen's point of view, I think anyone who's he was certainly angry at the cant and the kind of, I'm suffering too, the bottomly, but I think it seems to me that, I mean, I guess reading his letters recognized that there were going to be people, by virtue of where they were not going to be able to experience that, and that wasn't their fault. It was about having an understanding of that sacrifice that was beyond simply the God and king and country, but was actually suffering. Right. That was, I think, what he was arguing. I think what he's trying to say in Greater Love, and what I think he's doing in his best poems is, and that's the sort of pity element that he's getting at, is that you have to accept that this is a sacrifice that doesn't have glory in it, that's my reading. I don't know.
Right.
I don't know what other thing.
If I can add a bit there, Jane, I mean, I don't know the reference that Viv mentioned. I have to go ahead and read that one, but it's always seemed to me that poems like these two, and Insensibility and one or two others, are in a sense, I won't say a phase, because that trivializes it, but it's something that Owen had to work through. I mean, so much happened to him after he got to Craig Lockhart, and Brock started working on, and he met Siegfried and all the rest of it. And I always got the impression that somehow he needed to assert something about his own self-worth, if you like. I mean, all the messages, direct and indirect, that he'd had over the past 6 months about his capability as a soldier, or lack of it, and how the army saw him and what they were going to do with him or not do with him, and all the rest of it. And there is a sort of an insistence in quite a lot of what he writes on the significance of what he's been involved in. And going to the letters as well, particularly immediately after he's met Sassoon, when he sends stuff home to his parents, to his mother, and comments on what he's sending. And again, there is this sort of forwarding of himself as a, he envisioning himself as a spokesman, as a sort of bardic voice from the battlefield. And if I can just mention one quick example, remember that very early draft of Anthem for Doomed Youth, which is in the first person, where he says, I forget the exact phrase, but what candles should I be? And I will light them, he says, me, I'm the one who can do this. And then, of course, as he works it through, he shifts his stance several times to you and then to they. But I think that's part of it as well, Viv, if I can put it that way, that he needs to do this in order to be able to move on to those much more sort of not tentative, but much more provisional and much lower key poems of 1918,
right,
where he is, not at all as assertive as he was earlier on.
Mm.
Meg,
Thank you
you
very
have your
much. Thank
hand
you.
up.
Sorry, who had their hand up?
Meg.
Yes.
Oh, Meg.
Yes. This is just trailing an idea, really. When I first read the poem in my teens, of course, I didn't know anything about the manuscript history or the other influences. And I read it, at least in part, as Owen talking to himself. Weep, you may weep, you may touch them not. In the way that Sassoon talks to himself in Aftermath. Have you forgotten yet? I can't prove this textually at all, but I wondered whether that might seem to be part of Owen's drift as well. He's discussing, accusing, condemning, challenging, whatever it is, not only a lot of other people, including Bottomley, but also himself.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Paul,
did you?
Sorry, Jane.
No, go ahead.
I would go along with that, Meg. Yes, I mean, I think there is a lot in the manuscripts when you look at the way that Owen backtracks and revises and corrects and alters and starts again. I think there is a lot that suggests there that he is testing himself in the sense that, you know, he might think he knows what he wants to say, but when he looks at it, it isn't quite what he meant, and he doesn't quite know what it is that he does want to say, so he's going to try 15 different versions until it sounds right.
Exactly.
But I think it is a dialogue with himself a lot of the time too, yeah.
I know we've reached 8 o'clock, but we've had another question, and people feel free to, if you have to go, fine, but I'm going to carry on just a little bit because I had a very interesting question from Roger Watkin. Roger, did you want to unmute yourself and say, or would you like me to read it out? Well, I've put you on the spot now, so.
No, I'll say, I'm looking at verse 4, in the witnessed exhortation. Faces that used to curse me, scowl for scowl, shine and lift up with passion of oblation, seraphic for an hour, though they were foul. And just following the thread of the super discussion, conversation we've had, of who is being addressed, whose words are behind some of Owen's words, I just wonder whom the narrator of the poem, the speaker of the poem, is addressing. On the one hand, talking of faces that used to scowl, used to curse me, which is not a picture I have of Owen's experience, I have to say, but please put right in that. And also that at the end of that verse, he then has to talk about them being foul. And I wonder what ideas people have, or knowledge and information people have about that.
Thomas has a response, I think, don't they?
Who does? Sorry, please.
Thomas will do.
Thomas, yes. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. Hi. I thought when I read that in Owen's early days, when he first met his regiment, he was disgusted by many of the people that he met, and he was actually very upset by the swearing and all that sort of thing. And I'm sure that as an officer, initially there would have been a big gap between him and many of the people he was rubbing shoulders with. And part of the whole process of becoming an officer is to bridge that gap as a human being. His development going from the priggish young man that he was when he started, that's my description, to the hero as he was, again, how I see him, as he ended his days. It could be those people that he was talking to, And I also think that throughout everything that I ever see or read, I try to remember that he's a man on a mission. His mission is not only to speak to the people there and then and the people at home, but actually he said, and I can't quote in the same way that some of the speakers are able to quote, but I do remember he said that this writing may not be for a benefit to this generation, but actually to future generations. And I feel like that mission is also integral, even though he goes into particular themes with his poems. It's always there, and therefore it seems to me consistent with that as well. That his writing is on multiple levels. It's really one of his great strengths, I feel. I don't know what.
Yeah, I mean, I would go with that. I mean, there is a fair bit in this poem which isn't specifically about Bottomley. I mean, I mentioned Leslie Gunston sort of creeps in there, and Wilfrid can't help himself in a way. And to some extent, that comment about the men, again, well, that's not quite what he means to say to Horatio, I think. But just for a quick example, I would compare that with something like Inspection. Remember the poem where what do you mean by coming on parade like this? And then the man explains that he's had a wound and so on. Well, blood's dirt. And again, it's Owen has got to somehow work through the way he has found himself having to treat other human beings who depend on him as much as he depends on them. It's not something that he likes always, but it's the way things are and the way things work, and that's how you survive. If they don't do what you tell them, then you're all dead. So whatever he thinks of them, they're stuck with it.
Yeah.
Jane, could I add something?
Yes, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Did Sam have his hand up?
I think it may be just that he wanted something to rhyme with scowl.
Potentially.
He's searching for a rhyme, and he's got to put something down, and that's about it.
Possibly. Elizabeth.
I think Thomas is exactly right. I've always read that stanza as definitely referring to the men he commanded, who may have cursed him, go over the top, boys. I wouldn't be at all surprised if occasionally there were some curses in response to that. But I think the seraphic, for a moment, though they were foul, is describing precisely the kind of combat exultation that he talks about elsewhere in Spring Offensive and in other poems as well. These are people who are covered in mud. They haven't bathed for who knows how long. They are, objectively speaking, foul. But at the moment when they are all going into battle together, they're seraphic for a moment. So I think that fits perfectly with the idea that he's talking about soldiers whom he is in the position of commanding, and that he's recognized, okay, they're foul-mouthed, and they're also in the trenches, genuinely foul, and yet he sees them as seraphic when he calls upon them to do what they have to do.
There's a letter where he says, "Is it? I lost my senses and fought like an angel."
Yeah.
So it's this is what happens. It's that transformative thing that happens under that extreme pressure.
Yes,
And that is also the greater love, isn't it?
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that comes in at the end of Spring Offensive as well, with superhuman inhumanities, long famous glories, immemorial shames, the interleaving of those things together.
Yeah.
And I think too, it's also extremely biblical, isn't it?
Yes.
Particularly Old Testament, the notion of the prophetic voice who looks at it's always his, isn't it? His people, and sees them as foul. Think of the things that Jeremiah said about the people of Jerusalem and so forth, and describes them that way, that there's no doubt that he cares about them, but he cares about them so much that he can't help but see their foulness. It would be interesting to know whether the word foul, in the way you've described it, Elizabeth, had that sort of association at this time, wouldn't it? That the people's appearance could be foul. I just don't know. It's just an interesting thought across my mind as you spoke in a very, you spoke in a very convincing way. But I'm just interested to know whether that appears elsewhere.
I think it is. I can't cite an example, but just thinking of reading a great deal of fiction from the teens and 20s, modernist works, poetry before that, I think you could talk about someone whose clothing was fouled, or whose hands were fouled, or whose person was fouled, meaning dirty, meaning covered with mud or dirt. So I think one could check that.
Something to check the OED.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But my impression is that yes, that is within the semantic range of the time, though I'm not absolutely certain. It's a good point.
And I'm certainly not. I was just intrigued.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Is there any other final things people are burning to say? I mean, we could go on all evening. I'd love discussing.
One little thing, I see Andrew Palmer watching, and I'd just like to say how much I'm enjoying reading his book on the Remembered Dead, which I've just recently been given.
Well, thank you, Sam, for that segue into the announcement, because we are indeed very fortunate to have Andrew as our discussant for the next meeting on the 6th of May, and indeed have the book here, everyone. And he's going to be talking about the show and mental cases. And if you haven't read his book with Sally Minogue, it's The Little Plug, published by Cambridge University Press, and we very much are very grateful for his insights to come. So, and Andrew's here with us tonight, so thank you very much, Andrew. We very much look forward to.
Thank you so much. It was very kind. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. Yeah, see you next.
Great.
Can I say there's a review of the book in the last Owen Journal?
Oh, very good. Very good. Well, I realize we're slightly over time, but it's been wonderful to have this discussion, and thank you so much for everyone who contributed. I hope people who just sort of sat and listened enjoyed discussion, and we hope to welcome you to the next event. Bonnie has put a couple of links into the chat for everyone, and also about, again, joining the association. There's been some updates to the website, and I'll try and do those as we search out a more qualified social media guru to look after it. But until then, please go there for any information. If anyone would like, I can certainly send out the references that I've used in my bit, and Paul may have some that we can pass on. So we'll try and get those to people if members would like to have those. So I guess that just remains for me to, again, thank Paul Norgate. Thank you, Bonnie, for managing the talk, and to everyone who came this evening. And we look forward to seeing you again next month.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you
you very much indeed.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Good evening.
Have a marvelous evening.